Hello everyone, investment scams rampant. Please vigilant and discerning. Do not trust information from unknown sources. Please make sure recognize two official Capital Securities community, Facebook, Capital Securities, YouTube, Capital Wealth Insights.
Hello everyone, I'm Dong Jocksman, Tony. Now let's get started with today's session. Good evening. All right, today we have a big topic, one that's been eagerly anticipated and is finally here. Of course, it's about the new candidate for the chair of the Federal Reserve. The likely pick has pretty much been revealed, and I think it's almost certain now. Second, let's take a look at how the market reacts, or how should I put it? I think the stock market is actually more efficient than most people think. Sometimes people's opinions are pretty straightforward. If they think you passed, then you passed. If they think you didn't, then you didn't. Why do we say this? Let's talk about it using the earnings report that was released after the market closed this Wednesday. So let's take a look. First, let's look at the Fed chair. Trump, on Thursday, said that the Fed chair nominee would be someone well known in the financial world. Then he also mentioned that the nomination for the Fed chair would be announced on Friday morning. So everyone's speculation pretty much wrapped up yesterday. I'll talk about who this person is in a bit. Also, he mentioned that the announcement will be made tomorrow morning, which means Friday morning in the US and tonight in Taipei. Now, why is it on Friday and not the week after next? Let me explain something to everyone. The term of the Fed board member, Myron, runs until January 31st, which is Saturday. If a new chair isn't appointed, that means Myron will continue to serve. Because once he continues his term, his position is secured. Now, do you want to let him continue? According to congressional procedures, technically you don't have to, and even if you do, there's a special situation. There's a mechanism for a short-term appointment. Basically, it means letting him keep doing the job until Congress confirms it and then makes it an official extension. But for current board members, unless something really bizarre happens, since they've already been approved by Congress once, unless they do something outrageous or totally unacceptable, most people would just let the Federal Reserve board member continue their term. Now, moving on, aside from the spot for Barr, previously the market was watching two positions that might be expected to open up. The first one is Powell's seat, the position of board member, mainly. Powell's term as chair runs until May, and his term as a board member lasts until the end of January 2028. So regarding these two terms, theoretically, it seems like Powell isn't planning to leave or resign early, so this position won't become vacant for now. That leaves the rest. There's only one position left, which is Lisa Cook's seat. But the problem is, Cook's case has already entered legal proceedings. However, the court still hasn't made a decision regarding Lisa Cook, the court still hasn't ruled on whether or not she is eligible to continue serving as a board member. So this situation is really awkward. Now, with only one position left that can be changed, which is Myra's seat, that's why is it that Trump suddenly says next week, or says something else, or talks about moving things up? In the end, it seems like a final decision has been made, and the announcement should be coming tomorrow. So if the announcement is made tomorrow, it's very likely that the person will take over, just directly take Myra's position and become a board member. You have to become a board member first before you can be elected as the chairperson from within the board. That's the rule. So looking at how things are developing, if the announcement comes out tonight, it wouldn't be surprising at all. And then on another note, the news is saying, well, actually everyone in the US already knows, and the reaction in the financial markets is basically reflecting that. Everyone pretty much knows that Kevin Walsh is getting ready to take on the role of Federal Reserve Chair. But the thing is, the person who leaked this information said, well, this isn't the final result, and they requested anonymity. Also, the White House and Powell haven't responded. I think it's very likely that this insider is Bostic or someone close to Bostic. I think, first of all, Kevin Walsh doesn't really surprise me that much. Theoretically, there are a few main reasons. First, Kevin Warsh was actually Trump's top pick to push forward at the Federal Reserve. But as I mentioned yesterday, it seems that the Fed board members don't really like this candidate, and the folks in Congress probably aren't too fond of him either. So I think Kevin was basically returned, so to speak. He does have a PhD in economics and his credentials are solid, but he doesn't have any experience at the Federal Reserve. And similarly, take BlackRock's head of fixed income, for example. Even though he might be pretty well known in the bond world, the problem is he still doesn't have any central bank experience. So if you want to push someone like that in, even if you manage to get someone like that in, there's still a problem. They'd have to spend a lot of effort getting to know and working with the Fed's internal officials just to prove their skills and show where they really stand. And if your abilities aren't convincing enough, if your skills can't win people over, then it's going to be a lot harder to persuade the other board members or regional presidents. So that leaves us with the last two candidates. With Christopher Waller. So as for Waller, these two, one is a former member, that's you, and Waller is the current board member. But the thing is, when you put these two together, it's pretty much certain that it'll be the former member. Because why? Because Wacto's closer to Trump, right? I think that's a pretty important reason why Wacto's likely to be appointed. Also, Wacto visited the White House yesterday. And did you notice something else? I'm not sure if you caught this, but Wacto has a trait that's pretty rare in Trump's current team. In Trump's current team, among the Commerce Secretary and various other positions, Treasury Secretary Bessent, and then there's Greer and several other secretaries, like the Energy Secretary, the Housing Secretary, and so on. One thing about Trump's cabinet is that they really love to do TV interviews. But have you noticed that Waller almost never does media interviews, or at least does them much less frequently? So I think there's a unique characteristic here, and this is probably something the Fed or members of Congress would appreciate. It gives the impression that this person is more steady and composed. Now, let's take a look. Waller, who is 55 years old, served as a Fed governor from 2006 to 2011 for 5 years. It's a relatively short period, and as I mentioned yesterday, his background, his wife's family is actually a wealthy family. Also, previously, he served as an economic policy advisor for Trump's campaign, so that's pretty significant. In 2017, when Trump was the president and Powell became the Fed chair, he didn't choose to watch, but instead chose power. That means at that time, he probably had some contact with Trump. However, Powell was actually recommended by the Treasury Secretary at the time, and that's how he got the position. It was Trump who nominated him. So looking at it this way, it's possible that in the end, the watch was just Benson playing a supporting role on the side. But there's something important to mention first. Maybe when he was serving as a board member at that time, he was considered to have a rather hawkish stance. Let me just say, he was known for being hawkish, but of course, some people say that later on he became more dovish. Others wonder if it's because he's gotten older and isn't as aggressive as he used to be. Now, from 2006 to 2011, if you count from 2006 to this year, that's almost 20 years ago, about 15 to 20 years back. Maybe he's more mature now. But let's take a look at this. In 2011, during his term as a board member, some of his more hawkish remarks were pointed out. For example, at the end of 2006, during the Bush administration, the core PCE was 2.5. Now, the current core PCE is actually a bit higher than that. At that time, he expressed that his concerns about the inflation outlook were still there, even as there was still some momentum for growth. Then, in September 2008, right before the financial crisis broke out, the core PCE was 2.2. At that point, the FHFA had already taken over Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, and Lehman Brothers was on the verge of bankruptcy. But even then, he was still emphasizing concerns about inflation at that time. April 2009. He was even then still reiterating and emphasizing that the concerns about inflation were relatively high. This is something we'll see later. If we look at the market's reaction, it's one of the reasons why there was a rather strong response from everyone when the nominee was announced. People think he's relatively hawkish, but we should also say that looking at his recent public statements, Wash's view on the economy is supportive of easing policies, that is, loosening and cutting interest rates. At least in the short term, that's what he's doing. I think his attitude might be to lower rates as much as possible within the range that allows it in the short term. But if he sees if inflation rebounds, he might also adjust interest rates rather quickly. That's a change he could make. Also, I want to add one more thing. The Fed, he previously mentioned that he wants to reform some of the Fed's mechanisms. That includes communication methods, disclosures, and a whole bunch of other things. Things like the models weighting, these kinds of details, maybe after he actually gets confirmed, he'll start gradually working on them. So just to remind everyone, in principle, he will pursue an easy monetary policy, that's for sure. However, the rate cuts might not be as large as what Trump has talked about. And in addition, he'll likely take other actions to reform the Fed. So its impact probably won't be limited to just interest rate policy. I think it could also include things like asset purchases, for example, QE1, or other liquidity management measures, as well as the release of economic data, gathering opinions, and incorporating feedback from the market. All of these could be factors that influence market sentiment. So this is something to pay attention to. After all, with a new person comes new policies, and we'll have to wait until they take office to see what changes they'll actually make. Now, as for the US dollar index, when I was preparing this material, it was roughly looking at around 5 or 6 o'clock, the US dollar index was rebounding. On Thursday, it had dropped, that's correct, but not long after this news came out, it rebounded. Bloomberg had a blog post where someone wrote a commentary saying that if Waller is nominated as chair, the US dollar could regain its vitality. That is, the dollar might not be as weak as it was before. Why is that? It's probably not going to be like what Trump said, cutting rates all the way down to 1% or even 0, nothing that extreme. So regarding the US dollar, the degree of weakness might actually be a bit better than people expect. Also, the yield on U.S. Treasuries, well, on Thursday it dropped, but on Friday it rebounded. You can see that as soon as people heard the news, it started to bounce back. What I want to say is, actually, to some extent, if Trump really chooses to compromise, he's basically admitting to the facts. Because if he wants to push for a high Fed or bring in a right-winger, he's just going to get. The situation is that these two promised him they would significantly cut interest rates, but once they're in, well, they can't really do it. And for everyone else, it could actually get worse. That's the more problematic scenario. On the other hand, if he chooses wash and water, there will probably be a rate cut, just not as much as everyone expects. Also, Wash might actually be better than Waller, because from what we see now, the current Fed chair, Powell, probably won't resign. The reason is because the criminal investigation. He was criminally investigated for testifying before Congress. I think, well, if it were anyone else in that situation, they'd make the same choice. No, they wouldn't resign. They protect themselves. Actually, compared to Waller, Watch would be a better choice. Because if Waller were to take that position, if he became the chair, his predecessor, his former boss, would still be in office. That would be really awkward. In that case, if communication ever breaks down, everyone would just turn to the former chair and look at his reaction to make decisions. That would basically create a sort of shadow chair, which would be even worse. At least if I was a previous board member and you became the new chair, even if I stayed on as a board member, I'd just do my own thing. I'd be a director, more senior than you, even though you're the chair. Your grades might be higher than mine, but I started before you, so technically you still have to call me senior. So in that sense, this should be easier for you to handle policy communication. Also, There are also people who have served as directors in a general association, so they have a better understanding of how internal communication works there. So I think this choice isn't as bad as everyone might imagine. Now, as for futures, of course, they're down. In a bit, we'll have a chance to look at the latest trends. I want to talk about something. I think there might be an opportunity, something immediate. It might be something that no one has really thought about, which is the risk of a policy error. Policy error. So what exactly is a policy error? Well, let me share a little bit of history, a small story. Back in the Nixon era, there was a Senate Majority Leader. So back in Nixon's time, inflation was also really high. If I remember correctly, it was still during the late stages of the oil crisis, I think. If I'm wrong, feel free to correct me. Anyway, I know that at that time, the Senate Majority Leader was someone named Burns. So Nixon used his influence to pressure him into lowering interest rates. And as soon as the rates were cut, inflation came roaring back. Because of that, the Federal Reserve later had to put in even more effort to bring interest rates back down in order to get inflation under control. So I think this is an example from the past based on the records of what was said and done back then and his experience and attitude. I think he's more likely to lower rates when it's possible, and when it's not possible and rates need to go up, he'll raise them too. So he should have a chance to avoid the biggest risk, which is the risk of policy mistakes. We have to recognize that the current situation in the US, both in terms of foreign affairs and fiscal policy, isn't very good. If something goes wrong with monetary policy, that would be a huge negative for the US and the overall financial markets. I think maybe, on the contrary, this actually serves a purpose. Now, moving on, let's talk about spot gold. Actually, on Friday, after hearing this news on Friday morning, there was a big drop. So let's talk about that. Actually, with a more hawkish candidate coming out, precious metals are definitely the biggest losers here. Why? Because previously there was talk about rate cuts, and interest rates are very sensitive for gold and other precious metals. So this has led to a major correction. And what's even worse is that silver actually dropped even more sharply before. Gold fell below 5,000, that's the spot price, and silver dropped below 100 as well. So this correction was quite significant. In a moment, we'll take a look at the latest price trends. But on the other hand, we should note that the number of expected rate cuts hasn't changed much. So in June, it's unlikely we'll see even a quarter-point rate cut. But by December or January, there's still a chance for close to a half-point cut. But we want to point this out to everyone. These numbers can change. The reason is that this isn't a mainstream futures contract, so it's possible that we won't see any significant changes until the main session opens tonight at 10:30. We're just letting everyone know in advance. So if you check this number tomorrow morning or next week, you can use the closing data as a reference. The closing data is for your reference, but if you're looking at it before the market opens, you should be a bit cautious. You'll probably have to wait until the main session starts trading, either at 10 or 10:30, for a more accurate number. From that perspective, there hasn't been much change in the number of expected rate cuts. Also, let me talk a bit about this. In Iran, at the Kennedy Center, there was a speech given to reporters. Recently, there have been talks with Iran, and they were told not to develop nuclear weapons and to stop harming protesters. So that's basically what was said in the speech. Also, to add, the Lincoln aircraft carrier has arrived in the Middle East, so that's basically the minimum show of force. The Lincoln has already arrived. If I remember correctly, there are also 2 more nuclear-powered aircraft carrier strike groups that should be arriving as well. So the minimum requirement has been met, but the other 2 haven't arrived yet. They should be in position within a week at most. At that point, I think the pressure will really ramp up. All right, and also, let me tease something. If anyone's interested, I can tell you why Trump was at the Kennedy Center last night. If you want to hear some gossip, just let me know. It's actually pretty interesting. Also, regarding Brent crude oil, actually Brent crude went up on Thursday, but then turned down on Friday. But I want to tell everyone because it seems like after Trump's speech, there might be some leeway on the Iran side. So oil prices should be more volatile and turning weaker. Plus, if the Fed chair is leaning hawkish, If it's hawkish, as long as the US dollar strengthens, all commodities priced in dollars tend to weaken more easily. Now, last night, let's first talk about the economic data. There was a release of non-farm productivity and unit labor costs, and the final numbers were consistent with the preliminary ones, so there were no surprises. So, the number of people applying for initial and continuing jobless claims was about 209,000. The previous figure was 200,000, which rose to about 209,000 or 210,000. So really 209,000 and 210,000 are almost the same, right? Also, the number of continuing claims has decreased, so it seems like the job market is still pretty stable. But there's still a problem. The biggest issue right now is that there are neither new hires nor layoffs. There's no firing, but also no hiring. This situation hasn't really changed. As for factory orders, they're still being influenced by transportation equipment, so the numbers look relatively strong. Why do I say that? Because factory orders actually include orders for durable goods. So the orders for durable goods are being driven by the impact of Boeing airplanes. Now, if we look at the overall factory orders and break them down into durable and non-durable goods, it's the same situation. Let's take a closer look and compare them. With transportation equipment, the yearly comparison is much higher. Excluding it, there's a slight increase, so performance is decent, but transportation drives the growth. For short-lived goods, inventories trend upward, matching the initial value. So tonight, what's pretty important is the PPI, the Producer Price Index data, is going to be released. It looks like the expectation is that tariffs' impact on manufacturing, on producers, is having an effect, but this impact is starting to weaken, so that's good news. Also, while we're on the same topic, let me take this opportunity to let everyone know. The Fed's blackout period has ended, and officials are starting to make statements. In particular, we see that Miranda started speaking. He'll be speaking twice, with 2 interviews. It seems one is with Bloomberg TV, and the other is with CNBC. Well, regardless, one is after 12 o'clock and the other is at 4 o'clock. That's 4 p.m. in the US. By then, Trump will probably have already announced his pick. I think Miranda will probably talk about who will be succeeding him. It's very likely that his term as a board member will be coming to an end. Also, and then Zhang Lui, the Fed's Muslim, will also give a speech. Also, the vice chair in charge of supervision, Michelle Bowman, will be speaking as well. These two, Muslim and Bowman, have actually been more hawkish in their stance before. Now, once Bowman withdraws from the Fed chair race, she won't be voting for rate cuts. So she's also going to speak today. Let's see what she has to say about the candidates or the economic outlook or the interest rate outlook. Now, as for Trump, actually recently in domestic affairs, he's been backing down, or rather compromising. I shouldn't say backing down. That's not the right word. It's more like compromising. After all, a major feature of democratic politics is compromise. You can't just do things your own way. So the so-called border czar, Tom Holmes, gave a talk in Minnesota saying that targeted anti-immigration actions need to be scaled back. In other words, the scale of these actions should be reduced, focusing more on targeted anti-immigration efforts and not doing it out in the open, like on the streets. Randomly arresting people? Yeah, it needs to be more targeted. Yeah, don't make it so that everyone who goes out on the street feels like they're a suspect. And well, people are also saying that the mission to crack down on illegal immigration won't stop. That's because this is a task Trump gave him, so he will definitely carry it out. All right, so it feels like immigration policy is slowly being discussed. After all, two very obviously white American citizens were killed. This really doesn't have anything to do with immigration at all. So Trump really needs to make some adjustments here, which is what people are hoping for. And then there's another thing. This is pretty important. Originally, it was said that the government might shut down on January 31st. But here, Trump and the Senate Democrats reached a preliminary agreement yesterday, so this should probably go through. It looks like there will be a temporary extension. Actually, if you look at it, there are 2 things in a row. Actually, 2 things, maybe even 3, including the selection of the next Federal Reserve chair. And as for what was just mentioned about the border and the accusations of lying and this agreement with the Democrats, actually, what I want to say is that it's not that Trump won't soften his stance. It's just a matter of whether the time is right for him. Now, there's an important point in this agreement. The Department of Homeland Security will be provided with 2 weeks of operating funds to allow time for negotiations. More time for negotiations. But the main point here is that this is specifically about ICE. I believe that at this point, Trump has to give a clearer explanation regarding the enforcement of immigration policies. ICE has already become an agency that enforces the law without any consistent standards, just acting arbitrarily. If this continues, it's going to cause big problems. So I think Trump will probably make some compromises here. This would actually be good for American society, and if it's handled well, it could also help Trump's campaign. So that's what I wanted to explain to everyone. Now, let's move on to the next topic, which is about earnings reports. On Wednesday, after the market closes, and Thursday before the market opens, there will be earnings reports released. Specifically, after the market closes on Wednesday, we have Facebook, Microsoft, and Tesla. KLA and IBM are also on the list, so let's use them as examples. Then on Thursday, before the market opens and during trading hours, Caterpillar, Raytheon, Lockheed Martin, and Valero will be releasing their earnings as well. Refineries, right? And LHX, L3 Harris, let's talk a bit about these. Then, after the market closes, WDC, SDK, and KLA will be announcing their results. And oh, Apple, we need to highlight something special about them. That is, I think the US market is actually pretty tough. Well, not just tough, but also quite strict. If the market has a consensus about you and thinks you're good, then you're good. But if you're really not good, your stock price will definitely reflect that. So this means, well, to put it in more academic terms, it's at least a semi-strong, efficient market. This is really important, and it's actually quite significant for us when it comes to investing. This is still a bit academic, but overall, we do have quite a lot of confidence in the US stock market. All right, now let's take a look at each company one by one. Let's start with the better performing ones. As I mentioned to everyone yesterday, among the 3 earnings reports from the Magnificent Seven, one was good, one was bad, and one was a dramatic turnaround. So let's take a look. The good one is Facebook. The biggest highlight is that you can see it jumped up by 10% and just stayed there. I think the most important thing about Facebook is that it had a gap down and then started consolidating for almost 3 months. That was also due to the impact of its earnings report. Then, after 3 months, there was a gap up, and you can see that here. The expectation is not necessarily that it has to keep going up, but basically, as long as it holds the gap and consolidates a bit more, that's enough. I think the biggest function or contribution of Facebook's latest earnings report is that it convinced the market that it can use advertising revenue to support its AI capital expenditures. So it's relatively, it's coming out of the previous gloom, which is good news. Now, another major breakthrough that needs to be mentioned is that they said they're going to expand their AI investment in capital. The spending level is on the high side, which doesn't really reassure the market. So yesterday, the stock dropped quite a bit. I actually talked about this on my show last night, but they still haven't provided any financial guidance for the first quarter or the whole year. I think that's a pretty significant shortcoming. Even though they have a capital support plan and have painted a rosy picture, I feel like if you don't show people your revenue forecast or expectations, if there's no reliable projected revenue number, then everyone is going to scrutinize you more strictly. Hello? Although yesterday there was news about Musk making an announcement, I think this is something I need to talk to everyone about. Yes, it's a positive catalyst that supports his company, but honestly, people are still pretty realistic. You can release good news if you have it, but if you don't, you can't just put on a fireworks show without serving up the real deal. So that's the more practical way to look at it. So there's talk about Space possibly considering a merger with Tesla and maybe even with XAI. There's a chance they might merge quickly as well. I think for Musk's overall development, SpaceX is extremely important because it's pretty obvious that low Earth orbit satellites are a direct business opportunity. This could help make up for some adjustments in his electric vehicle business, like how Tesla is no longer selling the Model S and Model X. So they're getting ready to work on this robot, but the production and launch timeline for the robot is set for the third quarter of this year. And even then, it's not certain. It might get delayed. So I think this is a pretty big challenge. However, if SpaceX gets involved, then this could really help with that. If there's a gap in revenue, this should be something they can overcome. As for XAI, I'm personally quite looking forward to it, even though XAI doesn't seem to have as much exposure, and previously there was some controversy surrounding it. Because with Psy, you could just say what you want and it'll draw nude pictures for you. This caused a big problem over in Europe. But I have to say, XAI is actually pretty smart, in my opinion. Compared to the free version of ChatGPT, I don't think there's much difference. Now, as for Microsoft, I think this is another issue. You could see that its stock price gapped down. Whoa, basically there was a gap down, then a rebound. The optimistic rebound after the earnings report was just a gap down, which isn't a good sign. So the first major weakness is that Azure, their cloud business, has started to slow down, right? So this is a major weakness. Once it drops, it's hard to imagine. You'd have to hope, or you'd start to question, like, does Microsoft have any new applications or innovations in their operations? People will only change their perception of you if there's something new. What's worse is that this disappointment comes from the earnings report itself, from unsatisfactory results. Now, if you think back to the previous example, take Facebook's situation, for example. They spent a full 3 months just to recover. So you really worry that Microsoft might end up in the same boat and that there could be ongoing corrections, which would be pretty stressful. Now, as for IBM, the main thing everyone is watching with IBM is its software sales and the progress it's making in AI. That said, these have been driving its financial reports and stock performance. There's also something important. IBM is undergoing a transformation, and they believe they can help their clients through it. To help navigate these more difficult and complex AI options, that is their consulting business, which has always been one of IBM's strengths. If they can really leverage this, it should definitely be a positive for them. And of course, there's also news about quantum computers. Here, I think IBM is still doing well. If this gap, meaning the stock price, continues to perform strongly, it doesn't necessarily have to go up right away. At the very least, if it can consolidate at these high levels and keep moving sideways, that's fine. So I think IBM has a good chance here. Caterpillar, this one still looks great. It's going up. The main reason is that the data center boom continues to drive its growth. It's a power infrastructure provider, and right now in the US, they're definitely building all kinds of power plants. So Caterpillar is basically benefiting from all this. And then there's Honeywell. This one is more of an automation equipment stock. It's been going up too, and you can see its performance is pretty good. Let me just say, today I'm focusing on the more important companies. It's not that every single one of them is going up, but honestly, about 80% of them are on the rise. Honeywell's demand is driving its revenue growth, and that's having a big impact. However, its profits have been affected by legal settlements, mainly the litigation and compensation costs that have been set aside. Also, after restructuring, they're actually planning to spin off some of their businesses. So this is something the market is paying attention to. So there will be news about this. But if you're not too familiar with it, just take it as information. It's enough to know that this is a U.S. company related to automation and smart manufacturing, and at least its stock price has been performing well. All right, and yesterday there was another really strong performer, Lockheed Martin. On Thursday, it surged by 4.23%. The main reason is that Lockheed Martin reached an agreement with the U.S. Department of Defense. They're going to increase the supply of the THAA missiles, and another piece of good news is that the number of F-35 deliveries also hit a record high. Plus, their missile sales have grown as well, so overall, their performance has been pretty strong. However, there was an upper shadow on the candlestick chart. In principle, I think interest rates might have a short-term impact on them, but I believe they'll still benefit from the defense sector and continue to perform strongly. So LG Harris dropped, right? That's because it's actually a communications equipment integrator. They mainly handle communications devices. They supply products to Lockheed Martin, General Dynamics, or Northrop Grumman, so those companies can integrate them into their complete system solutions. Its revenue and earnings were unexpectedly below expectations. The business performance was relatively weak, which was quite surprising. But I want to remind everyone that at the beginning of January, the U.S. government did invest in its missile division. So actually, it does have a solid foundation, but it's just hard to understand why. This quarter's revenue, the fourth quarter's revenue, was unexpectedly below expectations. And as for the outlook for the first quarter this year, it's also not very strong, which is something we need to keep an eye on. I think there might be a chance. Let me take a look at the fundamental numbers for everyone, and then I'll report back to y'all. So Valero's an energy company. Previously, its stock gapped up and kept rising. Why? Because its main refinery is located on the Gulf of Mexico, nowadays called the U.S. Gulf, right along the Gulf Coast. So if I think about crude oil being extracted, it would be sent directly to their facility for refining. They would be a more direct beneficiary in this situation. So after that gap up you just mentioned, the stock has been consolidating at a high level. It's just that yesterday it closed with a long bullish candlestick. So maybe we should keep watching how the situation with Iran affects oil prices. Of course, in the long run, I still think the Gulf Coast area, including the U.S. on the North Shore and Mexico, it's pretty tough. At the southern end of the Caribbean, you have Venezuela and Guyana, which are basically right at America's doorstep. So let's keep an eye on what happens there, because there have actually been quite a few developments lately. I especially want to add this point for everyone. Also, let's take a quick look at the earnings report that was released after the market closed this morning. Apple saw a slight increase of 0.72%. Their quarterly revenue hit a record high, and sales in China went up by 38%. Wow, that's something. Yeah, this situation in China is really something. It's like people say they don't want it, but their actions speak louder. They still obediently go out and buy Apple products. Apple is still really impressive. Also, both revenue and earnings beat expectations, but the stock price still dipped a little. I think this might have been influenced by the Fed chairman, but our analysts' take is that Apple's revenue and earnings, basically their performance and profitability, are seen as steadily growing. So I just wanted to share that with everyone. Now, about WTDC, Western Digital, right? They make hard drives, basically memory-related products, that whole sector. For this part, their revenue and earnings seem to have exceeded expectations. But actually, well, maybe their outlook didn't meet expectations. In fact, if you look at their after-hours numbers, the stock actually dropped, which is pretty weak. There's a really strong one coming up, which is Sandy, who works on Netflix. We should mention that their second quarter revenue and earnings far exceeded expectations. And for this quarter as well, their revenue and earnings were way above forecasts. Expectations were good, and demand was extremely strong. So if you look at their revenue, the forecast was 26.7, but it came out at 30.2. And then for earnings, the expectation was it was 3.08 per share EPS, but it actually came out at 5.15. That's not just one level above expectations, it's more than two levels higher. So it's really impressive. After yesterday's big surge after hours, today's after hours jump is 20.5%. Yes, you heard that right, 20.5%. US stocks don't have price limits like in some other markets, so it just shot up by 20%, basically hitting the equivalent of a limit up. Here, I just want to add that, in my opinion, anything related to memory chips, the fundamentals still look solid. If today's closing price can hold up and doesn't end up with a long upper shadow, I think that's a positive signal for anything related to memory chips. Now, yesterday, KLA, the semiconductor equipment company, released a report, and honestly, it wasn't good. Alright, so even though Yizhu and Yinyu both made profits, the problem is they didn't beat expectations by much. They didn't really exceed expectations. So the market's interpretation is that the profits aren't enough to support the stock price, which is why the drop was pretty significant. What I want to say is, if you really think things are good, if they really had exceeded expectations, the market would have reacted very quickly. And if things really aren't good, investors won't be fooled by the company's spin either. I think that's still very important. So for today, the financial reports that were released. So first, American Express. This is the most important one. Then there's APD, the industrial gas company. Their numbers are already out, and both revenue and earnings have beaten expectations. Revenue came in at $3.1 billion, while the estimate was $3.047 billion. So that's a beat. And even better, their earnings were $3.04. The estimate was $3.02, so this is better than expected. Also, LyondellBasell, I remember this is also a chemical stock, another industrial stock. And then what's more important today are ExxonMobil and Chevron. This is what everyone is paying close attention to. The reason is that Chevron is currently the only oil company still operating in Venezuela in the U.S. It seems like their production output in that area has possibly increased. ExxonMobil, previously, well, back in 2007, when Maduro nationalized the American oil companies and their staff, it was confiscated. Because they accepted the terms set by the Venezuelan government, 60% of the shares were given to the Venezuelan government, so they were allowed to continue extracting oil. But XML didn't do that. They resisted, so everything was confiscated. Okay, so I think the main points here are, first, what exactly is it? Will it be returned? And if so, how much is it worth? Then, secondly, as was mentioned before, Venezuela is not suitable for investment. And after saying that, Trump replaced them. So here, we don't know if, after a few days or weeks, there will be a more conciliatory or tactful statement. We'll have to wait and see the detailed content on this part. That's basically today's financial report. All right, let's quickly take a look at the market. Today, our main focus is to check out the pre-market performance. The S&P closed lower, communication services did well, but information technology didn't. Basically, everyone is just hedging. In a bit, you'll see that the Magnificent Seven index is pretty straightforward. Basically, Microsoft is being hedged against Nvidia, and then the rest are just pulling each other up and down. That's pretty much what happened in the market yesterday. That's about it. Also, you can see things like Southwest Airlines and Royal Caribbean. They both had really impressive gains. These are basically is driven by earnings reports. When the earnings come out and they're really good. Honestly, I think the U.S. stock market is truly efficient. The market reacts extremely quickly, and that's something a lot of other markets just can't do. Also, let's take a look. So the equal weight index went up while the NASDAQ went down, but it left a long lower shadow, and the Dow Jones had a slight increase. The Magnificent Seven index had a slight drop, but it also left a long upper shadow. The Philadelphia Semiconductor Index also had a small gain and left a long upper shadow as well. So there are about 3 indexes like this. The NASDAQ, the Magnificent Seven, and the Philadelphia Semiconductor Index all had small gains or losses, and all left long upper shadows. But this wasn't influenced by any news about the Fed's hawkish candidates or the new chair leaning hawkish. So if we just look at the technicals, the signals from yesterday's candlesticks were actually pretty positive. Next, let's take a look. Soon we'll switch directly to the Bimber screen. As usual, let's first check this out. Let's look at how the market performed, and then we'll answer everyone's questions. So first, let's take a look. Come on, let's check it out. It's still going down, but the decline is narrowed. The Dow Jones is narrowed, and the S&P 500 is also narrowed, but it looks like the situation with this drop might mean today is destined to close lower. At least that's how it feels. Now let's take a look at the pre-market. All right, so the S&P DX is still very strong. The crazy rally is still going on. As for Deckers is in the outdoor sector and has performed well. It's up, but I didn't specifically mention it today. Why? Because it's just a single green candle in a series of declines. That kind of trend reversal hasn't really shown up yet, so I didn't specifically bring it up. Charter is the broadband internet company, so that's basically high-speed internet. It looks like it's going up, probably related to subscription fees or pricing. As for Western Digital, it's rising, and Micron is actually being pulled up along with it. Storage stocks are going up, and Colgate is also on the rise here. As for this one, I'm not too familiar with it. I don't know if it's a consumer product or an industrial product, but it's going up. Seagate is also rising, Corning Glass is still on the rise, and Verizon is up as well. Tesla had a short-term increase today. Okay, and then actually looking at LYB, this is what I was just about to mention, saying that this should be an industrial stock, and it has turned upward. That's what it looks like today. But the thing is, even though it's up, the increase is less than 1% when it's under 20. Let's take a look. Oh, Albemarle's down. This one, I don't think they're about to release their earnings report, but I'm not sure what the reason is. It dropped quite a bit. This might be related to mining stocks, and mining stocks are usually tied to basic metals. In principle, basic metals are also affected by interest rates, so it's possible for them to be relatively weak. I just finished talking and we haven't checked yet, looking at Newmont, that's a gold miner, and FCX is copper. So you see, mining stocks are all correcting today. If mining and raw materials are also correcting in the short term, I think if you're more of a long-term investor, there's no need to panic just yet. If you already have a position, just observe for now. If you don't have a position, you can wait for a better timing to get in. Why? Because right now, the advantage of raw material and mining stocks mainly lies in what we call key mineral resources. But these key mineral resources come from what's known as strategic demand. But the ones chasing this demand aren't China, but rather Europe and the US. And these are both wealthy entities. When it really comes down to fighting for resources, well, that's when things get really interesting. So just to let everyone know, that's basically the situation. Also, LL research is down, KOL is down too, and name research might get dragged down by KOA to MDM. Yenkai is also down. Now, let's take a look. If you look here at row 20, you can see that all of them have dropped by more than 1%. This basically reflects that today's market is relatively weak. Now, looking at the US stock market, the US dollar is still rising. Although there's a bit of a shadow and some gains have been given back, it's still making a rebound. As for US Treasury bonds, the 10-year bond has dropped quite a bit here. Although it's rebounding, it's not as strong as it was when the news first broke. I think we really need to pay close attention to US Treasuries. If the yield keeps climbing here, especially if it rises too quickly, you really need to be on high alert, because this could really be a key factor affecting capital allocation. As for gold prices, we just saw them drop below 5,000, but now they're back above 5,000. But let me tell you, in the short term, it's very likely it should also take a break. After running all the way up to this point, it's probably time for a pause. The reaction in silver prices is even more obvious. While gold prices have returned to 5,000, silver hasn't made it back to 100. So it feels like expectations around interest rates are still having an impact. As for the New York copper market, it's also fluctuating, but it's barely managing to maintain an upward trend. For now, we'll be using the New York copper price quotes because the London copper ticker always comes out really late, so we'll probably use this one for reference. Also, looking at the NASDAQ futures trend, it seems like there's a drop, but the decline is narrowing. Basically, I think before the market opens, the drop will be around 0.5% to 0.6%. We'll only see a bigger move once the main session starts. So the Nikkei index has rebounded. Now let's take a look at the PPI numbers. Oh no, that's not good. The actual PPI is 0.5, which is higher than the expected 0.2, and then 0.7, also higher than expected. Oh, this isn't very good. 3.0 and then 3.3. This isn't good either. This will probably affect the market today, making it unlikely for it to turn positive, huh? So why is that? Because inflation, or rather the PPI, is still on the high side. Although what really has more impact is we still look at the CPI, and mainly the Fed focuses on the PCE, right? But people also watch the CPI, and if the PPI is high, then the pressure for it to pass through downstream increases. So these numbers aren't great, and on top of that, you have a relatively hawkish Fed chair, huh? At least based on past records, the track record is hawkish, so that's pretty bad. Look, 3.0 and 3.3. If we're talking about nominal at 3.0 and core at 3.3, then let me ask you, right now, the benchmark interest rate for rate cuts is around 3.5, right? 3.6 is, well, 3.5 to 3.75. So there's not much room to cut rates. So this is actually quite troublesome. Here you have to see that the main factor affecting the Fed's rate cuts going forward, in my opinion, is still the inflation data. All right, now that we've finished looking at the market today, let's take a look at, let's move on to everyone's questions. Let's start with Zhang. Hello. Zhang's question came in at about 9:18. It feels like the market is reacting to a series of hawkish negative factors. Yes, that's right. As for Iran and other holidays, let's wait and see. I think it's even possible we might have to wait a few more days, because if today's focus is on the Fed chair and if the market overreacts, then well, I think Trump is more likely to wait a little longer, and since there are ongoing talks, since they're talking, there might be a better outcome. Oh, and by the way, some of you are curious about the gossip. Why did Trump go to the Kennedy Center? It's because there was a premiere at the Kennedy Center yesterday. The premiere was for a movie. The movie is called Melania. Now, if you know about the Trump family, Trump has had several ex-wives. His current wife is called Melania Trump. Okay, it's a documentary, and it's a documentary that records the 20 days after Trump's election victory, focusing on everyone's inauguration, and it's told from Melania's perspective to document Trump. So the lesson here is, this movie looks, you can tell from the box office, it's relatively not very appealing. So I heard they spent $40 million making it. $40 million. And Melania was both the producer and an actress, since it's from her perspective, so she also acted in it. I heard she took 60 or even 70% of the budget. So 60% of 40 million? Yeah, 60% of 40 million is 24 million, and 70% is 28 million. You do the math. Over 20 million, maybe even $30 million just for her salary. But let me tell you, do you know this? This will be, it's going to be shown on Amazon Prime, or maybe it's Amazon or Netflix that's going to stream it. Do you know who funded it? Yeah, the investor is Jeff Bezos. So if you don't know who Bezos is, let me tell you, he's the founder of Amazon, and he put up $40 million to help Melania make a documentary. And in it, more than 60% of it is Melania's salary. So listen up, I want to tell you this. Poverty really limits our imagination. This is how the rich spend their money. That flattery, man, is on another level. This is the highest level. The movie's earnings don't matter. What matters is that Melania is happy. If Melania is happy, then Trump is happy. And if Trump is happy, you know you'll be happy too. That's all I can say. Anyway, this is just some major gossip, you know? Now, let's take a look at the Hormuz Strait being blocked. Well, that's kind of a hassle, but honestly, I don't think the Hormuz Strait will actually be closed, because the oil from the Hormuz Strait mainly goes to Asia, not Europe. So this really shouldn't be a big issue. Yeah. All right, it's already been announced. It's basically him. So pay attention to the bill. Government officials and all that can be postponed. Yeah, the U.S. actually figured it out. Is the software really that bad? Let me tell you, the biggest problem with software is that the previous leader, which was pretty strong, was Microsoft. But now, because its financial report didn't meet expectations, it got knocked down. Also, software has an inherent disadvantage. I mentioned this yesterday, but maybe everyone didn't quite catch it. Because a company's capital expenditure is a fixed amount of money that needs to be allocated. But now, companies are putting that money into AI-related capital expenditures. The portion that used to be invested in software companies is no longer going to them. That's why, after the initial AI boom, software has been struggling all the way up to now. The most concrete example you can look at is a company called Salesforce, CRM. It's just been weak all the way. This is the most important point. All right, so Oracle has dropped so much, it's practically spineless now. It's really pitiful. As for Honeywell, B-Band, you have to watch SanDisk Sandy. That's right. Okay, NVIDIA, OpenAI, Oracle. Look at NVIDIA. Actually, let me tell you, OpenAI, there was even news yesterday that Amazon wants to invest in them. All right, so I think OpenAI is still a problem. Up to now, it's still in that phase of burning through equity capital. If you really want to do well, you have to find a way to stand on your own 2 feet. That's the biggest issue here. When the dog barks, if someone drops, someone else will pick it up. Yeah, that's what I think. Let's wait a bit, because I don't think there's any need to speculate about what will happen with Taco. All right, the main thing is, maybe this candidate is someone both the Federal Reserve and Congress can accept, so Trump choosing him isn't as bad as everyone thinks. Basically, what this reflects is that the Federal Reserve's position is to cut rates for you when they can. Actually, Trump hasn't really thought one thing through. If he wants to cut rates, first, don't cut them so fast or so much. Adjust your mindset first. Second, if he really wants to cut rates quickly, there's actually something he needs to do, and then rates will drop quickly. That thing is, just keep your mouth shut and stop meddling with the Fed. Once you leave them alone, they'll find reasons to cut rates for you. The more you interfere, the less likely they are to do it for you. These scholars, that's pretty much their temperament. All right, so as for their so-called great relationship as a couple, don't believe it for a second. When it comes to politicians and wealthy business people, their marriages are all for show. Come on, you were a model before, and your specialty was reality TV drama. Let's not get into all that right now, okay? Let's not talk about it. The past is the past, and at least she was a top model, a real one, okay? All right, now as for the gossip about Biden's son, come on. That guy is the ultimate prodigal son in history. There's really nothing more to say about him. Yeah, Jimmy Kimmel said, "Hi, Grandma, it's been a few days." Actually, it was watching Jimmy Kimmel's talk show that made me think, hey, this could be a fun bit of gossip to share and lighten things up for everyone. After all, it's Friday, right? As for the impact of this watch on the market, I still think it will have an effect. But I think, of course, individual reactions will differ. If something was overhyped before and doesn't have any real fundamentals, if it's just based on expectations, then now it's going to give back those gains. But for things with stronger fundamentals, like those with more active support, there might still be some backing. And most importantly, maybe this candidate isn't particularly eye-catching. I don't think they're that attention-grabbing. People can keep watching for a bit. I don't think this person will necessarily be a disappointing Fed chair. Finally, let's answer a question from Jean Malouf. The software seems to be... it seems pretty weak. When will there be a turnaround? I think, it might still be a while before things improve. Yesterday, I specifically looked into a company called Intuit. It's a company that makes tax filing software. In the US, it's called TurboTax. Yes, TurboTax in the US. A lot of people use it, especially Chinese international students who stay there to work will all use it. Why? Because it's not expensive, about 50 or 60 bucks a year, and once you buy it, you can file your own taxes. And don't doubt it, if you think $50 or $60 for software is expensive, that's just how it is in the US, because US tax laws change all the time, and there are actually a lot of different ways to file taxes, and even after you file, it doesn't necessarily mean you pass. There's still a chance you could get audited. So in the end, everyone just buys tax software. And when is tax season in the US? Well, I can tell you, it's from January 15th to April 15th. I have a friend who's an accountant, so I know. Don't bother looking for him between January 15th and April 15th. Yeah, once it's over, people finally come out and show up again. Let me check. TurboTax is really taking a hit. So, you see, if you're wondering whether this sector is getting squeezed, of course it is. So maybe this is something everyone should keep in mind. And then Microsoft. Yeah, Microsoft. Actually, you might not realize what it's up to. So the Dow Jones is also a major index, and the S&P is a major index too. And as for the NASDAQ, it's also a big player in the industry. After all, it's such a huge company. It's still a company that everyone keeps an eye on. So lastly, there was a question about that ETF. Well, as you know, on our Gangbo Zimu program, it's pretty tough for us to make comments, especially when your target is so obvious. So you'll just have to ask someone else about that. Sorry about that. Don't blame me. Don't get mad at me. All right, let's take a look. If there are no more questions, that's about it for today's show. So, see you next week.
Our company has no improper financial interests in the individual securities recommended or analyzed. The information in this program is for reference only. Investors should make independent judgments, evaluate carefully, and bear their own investment risks. If you don't want to miss the latest market updates, be sure to turn on the notification bell and hit subscribe. In addition, we have plenty of great video content on both Facebook and YouTube. Don't miss out. In our group, we share in-depth explanations of global financial events with you every day.